it's been a while since we have been here with you. I know we have about 170 joining us today for this very important topic, the Federal CARES Act funds, how and the urgency to access those. We'll get to that in a minute with our panel of experts, which we'll introduce. But just a few housekeeping items. First, again, welcome back. We have rebranded as WorkWise. We are incorporating new topics aside from COVID and going back to school. We have mental well-being, budgeting for equity coming up, obviously preparing for some challenging budgets ahead. And so we have, again, rebranded. Thank you again for joining us. We do have the presentation loaded in the Q&A. You'll find that link there from Sarah. And always know that we are taking questions and aggregating those in these sessions. And also there are often questions that we need to go do research on. And so Sarah does a wonderful job of getting that information, feeding it back to the audience on questions that may come up during the session. So again, WorkWise, we're happy to be rolling out or picking back up on that schedule. We've also rebranded our podcast, and so CASBO Connect is going to be a new podcast series with Eric Dill and Tina Douglas. Happy about that. And on November 9th, they're going to do a post-election analysis. So that is available on the CASBO website under the resource tab. CBO Symposium, November 19th and 20th, and we've added a second session in January. We feel like there's so much conversation to have that we need to continue to support beyond one event. So January 21st and 22nd, registration is open for that. And again, the next session, the first session is November 19th and 20th. So, you know, I mentioned earlier that WorkWise is definitely focused on some of our current situations as well as some other leadership challenges that we all face. But let's talk about the current situation and the urgency of this conversation today. I want to ask that you, our audience, are extremely vocal in expressing why perhaps we have not yet drawn down these funds so that we all better understand that. But here's our current reality. We have to be drawing down the funds now. I think that in everyone's mind we have till the end of the year, but technically yes, but philosophically no. Our state has gone to the feds, asked for money that we have been given, and it makes it a very difficult conversation the next time we need to go back if we have money that's unused, one. Two, for our own CASBO activities at the state, to go in and ask for money as we continue to know that there are significant pockets of money that we need. Again, if we have not drawn down what has been provided to us, it makes a very difficult conversation for our advocates and for our legislative activity, our legislative committee across the street. And three, the state will begin to move these funds to other areas of need. So the urgency for us to access these funds is significant. The timing is now. And we've brought a panel of experts together to talk about that, to share with you what is available, and also to hear from you what is in the way of us taking immediate action on this. So with that, you know that I'm Tasha Davenport, Chief Executive Officer here at CASBO. Sarah Bodchez, our Chief Governmental Relations Officer, is always a smiling face on these webinars with us. And today we're joined by Elly Garner, the Director of Government Affairs Division of CDE. Thank you, Elly. We have Joseph Sines, Federal Liaison for CDE, Dan Merwin, Fiscal Policy Consultant, and Amy Tang-Paterno, Education Fiscal Policy Consultant, also a CDE. And finally, Michelle Giese, the Policy Analyst for CDE. So they've brought their full team. We have our full team of 170 interested in this topic today. Let's go.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I have to tell you, we have a fantastic team at CDE, and we're excited to be here. So I guess I'm jumping in. I'm Elly Garner. I'm the director of the Government Affairs Division, but the rest of my team is really the brain behind operation of the CARES Act reporting information. I'd like to be really honest with you. When you email caresact@cde.ca.gov, you are actually reaching out to this team. This is the team that's responding to you and is working on this issue. So we are really hands-on here. And so they are the experts. So as we dive in, I'm going to hand it right over to Joe Sines on my team to kind of lead us through some of this conversation as we get started. Thank you all for leaning in on this issue. And thank you again for highlighting the importance of getting these dollars spent and utilized appropriately. Appreciate it.
Amy, you're muted, but and actually passing it, Amy Tang-Paterno will kind of take the start for us here.
First few slides, and hopefully my internet's going to cooperate because it's been very spotty this morning, so I'm like crossing my fingers I can get through my slides. Again, I'm Amy Tang-Paterno, and I will be going over the data collection and reporting timelines this morning. So as you know, California was provided with $5.3 billion in learning loss mitigation funds, also known as the LLMF fund. It is made up of three funding sources: the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, also known as GEAR, and the General Fund. When Cycle 2 reporting closed in early October, a little over 50% of the CR funds were expended. We reopened the system last week, and because a lot of LEAs indicated they needed a little bit more time to update their expenditures and obligations, we held it open until October 31st. And the total expenditure and obligation did increase slightly to 60% after the close of the system. And next slide, Sarah, please. So this is the actual data that was collected as of October 31st. It indicates the latest data collection. The slide indicates the latest data collection on the CR fund. Expenditures is at 31%, obligation at 29%, total with expenditures and obligation at 60%. When we look at the top 100 largest LEAs, which represents 57% of the fund allocation, the total expended and obligation is pretty consistent with the total expenditures and obligation at 57%. There's still about 112 LEAs that have zero expenditures and obligations. So as you can see from the slide, there is quite a bit of money still left to be spent before December 30th, 2020. And next slide. Oops. Can you go back one? Uh-oh. Okay. There is a slide missing. It's the interim report. I'm not sure. Somehow we left that out. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. We don't have a slide, but it's the interim report. To gauge LEA's expenditures and obligations before December 30th deadline, the CDE is planning to have a Cycle 2.5 interim report. The report will be much simpler than a regular quarterly report. Basically, it will ask LEA expenditures and obligations from March 1st through October 30th. And it'll ask for any future planned expenditures. This will then give us an indication of what will not be expended and what can be reverted back to Department of Finance. We're hoping what the reversion is going to be zero, but we understand that there are going to be some unexpended funds. Michelle, are you able to share a screen to show the actual reporting system? So Michelle's going to share the screen and just kind of let you look at, oh, here's the slide that we left out. And here, so just basically it's going to be very simple. What's your total allocation, your expenditures, your obligations and your planned expenditure, and it will auto-populate what the remaining balance will be, and that will be the unexpended amount that will be reverted back to Department of Finance. And then Michelle's going to quickly show you how the system will actually look like. So this is not finalized yet, but it'll look very similar to this. We will have a 2.5 version. And Michelle, if you want to go into the actual 2.5, and this is, we're kind of going to pick on Alameda Unified and look at what the reporting system is going to look like. You're going to have pre-populated what the LEA was allocated and what they reported as expended from the last reporting cycle. And they will then report what they have spent from October 1st to October 30th and what their obligations are and what their planned expenditures will be through December 30th. And whatever remaining amount will be the unexpended amount that we are notifying finance, and that's the amount that they can revert and use for other purposes. Thank you. So we can unshare, and we will go into cycle 3 slide.
And Michelle, if you could give me the ability to reshare my screen. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. There we go. So cycle 3 report will open around 3rd week of December. I'm hoping to catch LEAs to report before winter break. The deadline for cycle 3 will be January 6th. The expenditure period from October 1st through December 30th. And as with the other reporting cycles, the reporting will include the CR fund, the GEAR fund, general fund, and the ESSER fund. Our understanding is that Department of Finance will be using cycle 3 data to start their reversion of unspent CR funds. Next slide. And this slide will give you future reporting deadlines. After cycle 3, there will be 3 more reporting cycles to update the report. The reports will be used to update things like changing obligations to actual expenditures. And that is my version of the presentation. I'm going to hand it back to Joe, who will talk about the CR Fund allowable uses.
Thank you so much, Amy. So today we're going to, on my portion, we're going to kind of cover the allowable uses, and I'm going to provide some links that many of you probably know, but just, good as a refresher. And then I can also go over a few of the questions we've received so far and just some questions we get a lot and we've definitely answered, but just to put them on everybody's radar. So for the CR Fund allowable uses, kind of the big overarching federal requirement for them is that they're necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19, that they were not accounted for in the budget most recently approved as of March 27, 2020, and they were incurred during the allowable period that begins on March 1st and ends on December 30th. Next slide, please. So also just, as an update, here's the Treasury Fund guidance on your screen, so that's definitely a useful link. Recently, some of the FAQs have been updated, which can be found at the second link there. And, it's important to keep mentioning that these funds must meet the federal guidance as well as the allowable uses for the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund, which can be found also on the Learning Loss website on the CDE page. Next slide, please. Okay, and so important that, LEAs are required to report on state and federal allowability. And one of the big issues we've kind of been running into for the CR Fund, that's for the federal usage of it, is that the creation of custom categories. Sometimes they're necessary. A lot of times we found them to be necessary for uses that deal with social, emotional health of students, if you're spending funds on that. Another, sometimes that's an allowable use. Some of the obligation information, if you've done bulk obligation, that was allowed recently, but LEA should refrain from doing this using custom categories to the greatest extent possible. I think in a lot of cases, sometimes we're getting things like connectivity as a custom category. That should be put in the distance learning category. Another one would be, anything dealing with professional development. That would be probably an administrative category. So really try as best you can to ensure that we're trying to get them use the custom categories as little as possible, because it makes it much more difficult when we're transferring this information to the Department of Finance, and then they're transferring it over to the U.S. Department of Treasury. So I think, one of the big issues too we're running into is some of the questions around salaries, of employees. And so definitely, for any questions, like it says there, you can go to the CARES Act email and, ask us any questions you want. We try to be as responsive as possible. Sometimes, a few answers, it takes us a little longer to dig into, but I think, based on the questions we've been receiving, I definitely want to speak to some of those just to give everybody kind of a heads up. So a lot of the questions around salaries, as I spoke of earlier, in general, the salaries can only pay for new personnel, existing personnel that have been repurposed to a substantially different position in response to the coronavirus, and personnel substantially dedicated to mitigating or responding to the COVID-19 public health emergency. So that could probably go for, school nurses, something like that. So that's a question we get a lot. Also, it's as you're looking to spend these funds, one place, that's been discussed that maybe LEAs could use is summer school teacher salaries if they were unbudgeted or expanded to cover additional students. And obviously they would be done in the summer of 2020, which would make them timely. Another possibility that, we've tried to communicate with LEAs on that subject. Also, things like school buses have come up quite a bit in our CARES Act inbox. So that's something, if you're using it for facilitating social distance, it could be used as possibly a, public health expenditure. But you always want to make sure that, again, it's related or in response to the pandemic, it's an unbudgeted cost, and that the expense is reasonable and necessary. So this would include evaluating other less expensive options, such as renting or leasing a bus. We do expect increased federal scrutiny on the use of these funds. So I would just, advise that you document on these type of purchases. You don't need a pre-approval from us for, capital expenditures that are $5,000 or greater for the CR fund. But if you're using ESSER gear, you do. But I would still keep in mind that you're going to, there is a chance for scrutiny on these. So just because you don't need pre-approval from us, don't just assume that, it's an okay purchase, and we always advise you to speak to your legal counsel in those situations. So I think those are, some of the big questions we've received, and I know we're going to be doing a question and answer later on, but I just kind of want to touch on some of those. That way we could, get them out of the way, but happy to answer any other questions. But I also want to ensure that the CARES Act reporting help page that's also listed is extremely valuable. We put a lot of information in there. It's kind of a lot, but I think it's broken up really well to where you can find what you're looking for, and it's a very good resource. So next slide, please. And this is where I'm going to pass it over to Dan Merwin.
Good morning, Joe. Thank you. So I'm going to cover expenditures and obligations. These are the definitions that you need to keep in mind when reporting, as well as some things around the deadline to be aware of, in particular excerpts from the federal guidance, just to keep in mind because it can determine whether or not a purchase is in fact going to be eligible, particularly around timing. So the first slide up here covers what is the definition of expenditure? Well, it's when approval for payment or a good or service has been received. The difference being you don't actually have to have paid for it. So this comes into play quite a bit with that last highlight around salaries and wages, particularly if a district does not do payroll until, say, the middle of the month. And you just past the end of September, you're not going to capture September's costs until October. You can actually report those in September because as soon as the labor has been provided, essentially the good has been received, that is an expenditure and it can be reported right away. This will again be critical when you're reporting expenses for December, not to just wait on for whenever you're going to run payroll in January. Now, this contrasts with the definition of obligations. Sarah, please. Next slide. Oh, there we go. So an obligation, I think the best way to think about this is like an encumbrance, but you don't include salaries and benefits. And that's specifically because per Department of Finance guidance, obligations do not include salaries and wages. Those are considered expenditures as soon as the labor has happened per the last definition. So generally your obligations are going to be your contracts, purchase orders, anything along those lines where you have already entered into an agreement to exchange money in exchange for a service or good, but the good or service hasn't occurred or hasn't happened yet. Sarah, if you continue. So as was mentioned earlier, the deadline for using these CR funds is between the period of March 1st and December 30th. Per federal guidance, you're only supposed to cover costs incurred during that time. However, there are a few key things to keep in mind and a couple of exceptions. One is when you're making purchases that may be delivered later, outside of December 30th because of a delay in the supply chain. The second bullet here does cover kind of a caveat of that would be allowed, assuming that when you entered into the agreement, the expectation is that it would have been delivered by December 30th. It was needed before December 30th, and due to these supply chain interruptions, it was just a little bit later. In order to determine that time as far as what that reasonableness was, federal guidance says it is all based around the time the delivery was sought. Supply chain interruptions after the fact, you're not going to be held liable for those. But if you know about it going into the contract, that's an entirely different story. If you can continue, Sarah. Another couple things to keep in mind. The items that you purchase don't actually need to be used in all cases before December 30th. The intent is that they're needed by December 30th, but there's a couple of things that allows you to hang on to those afterwards. For example, if you purchase something in bulk, and that's a typical procedure, and it would be really difficult to try and break out what you used prior to December 30th versus what you use after. So for example, say you purchased bulk cleaning supplies and you put in an order in October and maybe you didn't use all of it because the school hasn't reopened right away. You don't need to break that out. What you may be using in January or February or March could still be allowable under the CR funds. You can also purchase durable goods. Same thing, they need to be with the intent of being used before December 30th. But if you're purchasing something where the intent going into it is you would not need it until after December 30th, that's not going to be allowed. That's that last bullet clearly says it's not eligible. Next slide, please, Sarah. Now, the other way that this has come up a couple of times is prepayments. I've seen this a lot with contracts for, say, distance learning software, warranties for computers. And I understand why districts want to use the funds to prepay as much as they can. There are two provisions of federal guidance to really keep in mind. The bottom section of this slide says that if it's for use outside of the eligible time period, the December 30th, it's not covered. But there's an FAQ that does say a prepayment can be allowed if it's consistent with ordinary course policies and procedures. An example of where this may work is if you had a warranty associated with a laptop, standard procedure right when you purchase the laptop. That's your procedure.
We're going to have to ask you to repeat that part, Dan, because we lost you for a second after warranty.
All right, I apologize. So if you had a warranty for a laptop, standard procedure would probably be something like when you purchase the laptop, you purchase a warranty to go with it. So in that case, you would be consistent with this FAQ. If you were to purchase some kind of distance learning software and you're paying for it month by month anyways, and that's your normal procedure, then you couldn't do a prepayment. Hopefully that all came through, Sarah. Can you give me a thumbs up if it did? Okay, good. So I know this is a really tricky area. Some other things to keep in mind is maybe your district has a policy where you do prepayments if they give you a discount of like 5 or 10%. Well, if you have that policy and it's documented and it's something that you can stand behind when there's a federal auditor saying, why did you make a prepayment on this? That is something to consider. But this is also something you probably want to talk about with your legal counsel and maybe some other people in your district to see how comfortable you are with this, considering how much you could be risking. It gets more and more difficult the longer the prepayment is for. We had one district asked about a 5-year prepayment versus just something they get for this school year. So all those kinds of things to keep in mind. I think, Sarah, there might be one more slide. So recouping unexpended funds. Pursuant to SB 20 or 820, following funds that are not expended by December 30th will be reported to the superintendent within 30 days, and then we have to initiate collection proceedings. What we're going to do for administrative convenience is use the Cycle 3 report. Now that does end very close to the December 30th deadline, but it is one less report to fill out. We'd expect that collections would begin towards the end of January. One caveat with this is CDE's collection authority. The Department of Finance has separate authority under separate language. That is why we are doing the interim report that Amy covered earlier, with the intent of figuring out, for example, closed charters that for some reason claimed funds but never were going to use them. Those can be put to another use. But also if an LEA for legitimate purposes says, you know, we just can't spend all this money, or maybe their school board can't come to an agreement on what to spend the money on. And so, yes, there's a certain amount of funds that will be left on the table. The Department of Finance may come in early at any time and sweep that and try and put that to another use. That's why that interim report is going to be so critical. I think there might actually be one more, Sarah. So in 4 subsequent reporting cycles, after we get past cycle 3, there are still 3 more quarters worth of reports. We would expect, as Amy indicated earlier, that we would see those obligation amounts start to cycle down to expenditures, probably most of it within cycle 4. Maybe if you put in an order and you didn't receive it until April, you'd report that in cycle 5. You will be able to go in and make some downward adjustments if you had kind of overestimated the salary and maybe someone didn't work quite as many hours of overtime as you needed. But because funds are already going to be recouped, you can't go in and revise it up to claim additional funds afterwards. So that is just something to be aware of. And I think we've all said it, but we will say it again. The CARES Act email, please reach out if you have any questions. I know this is a lot, and the excerpts of guidance here are very small in like the 20 or 30 pages that are out there. So we'd be happy to share with you where to look if you want to provide that to council and consider what best works within your scenarios.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all that information. We have been getting questions on the Q&A box, and the way we've been proceeding with questions, if anyone wants to raise their hand, there is a hand feature, and Michelle will let us know and call on that person so they could ask it directly. But while we wait for that, people have already been typing in questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box separately. So I'll start with the first question I saw that was in my chat box. The question is there a chance to reallocate remaining funds to other school districts that have spent all of their funding?
I think that one's a little bit difficult. I think we'll have to circle back on that one. Amy or Dan, do you have any thoughts on that?
This is Dan. The funds were allocated based on trailer bill language, and there wasn't a provision in there about reallocating funds, so it would probably take a statutory change. And given that we're in the interim session, I don't think that would likely happen.
I'm sorry, Dan, but I was just going to say that there are very specific formulas that these funds are based on. So as Dan said, without statutory change, we cannot just reallocate the funds because it was based on a specific formula.
Can you provide a couple of examples where a custom category could be used for?
So social, emotional costs, definitely that's one we used a custom category for. I think that's probably the main ones that you should be using custom categories for. A lot of the ones that we've received so far, we feel like could fit into a different category. Professional development is one that comes up, but usually we find that can also fit in separate categories. Usually it traces back to distance learning or something like that. So I would say if it's, just more so, it's hard to, if you kind of gave me an example, it's easier for us to kind of go through, but usually if you can connect it to something, please do, as long as it, makes sense to do so. But yeah, a lot of them we're getting can fit into distance learning most times, or we get often like materials for distance learning in a custom category. Well, that should, be put into distance learning category. And so I would just say those are kind of the rules to go by. But yeah, social emotional is the one that I'd say we most agree that that's a custom category.
We have two in terms of positions. We have LVNs and RNs would both be able to be charged to CRF, and what about moving counselors into CRF?
I don't believe counselors, based on the guidance, would be allowable. I think it's very more public health surrounded, but from our discussions, it definitely seems like nurses, school side nurses would be allowable to use under public health. With the caveat being, make sure you're discussing this with, your own legal counsel and whether it makes sense in the guidance itself.
And I would just add to Joe's comment that there is a provision in federal guidance that talks about there are a couple of different public health, public safety positions that are considered to be kind of de facto related to COVID, and so you can more easily move their salaries and questionably their entire salary over. Medical professionals in schools are one of them. Can absolutely share that guidance if you want. Counselors probably wouldn't fall into the medical side because maybe more of a behavioral health issue, but definitely the services that they provide, if they're consistent with LLMF, then that would be something you could charge those hours to rather than their entire hours.
Is this accurate? Treasury will presume that expenses up to $500 per elementary and secondary school students are eligible expenditures, such that schools do not need to document the specific use of funds up to that amount?
So that is guidance that has been put out by the Treasury. The issue that we run into on that is, it's definitely something that we're discussing internally, but some of the issues that we run into that are, you're still going to have to show timeliness of a purchase. It very much, so if you spend the $500 also, it very much restricts what you can use subsequent funding for, which becomes another issue. And from a state perspective, you're still going to have to prove that it falls in line with the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund guidelines. So at this time, it's a little bit, it's not so clear cut. It's definitely something we are working through. We are discussing, but there's obviously, it's not just, let's spend $500 per student on whatever we want to spend it on, because I don't think that's definitely not going to work under our state guidelines as well.
So I'm going to back Joe up here a little bit. Joe hit the nail on the head. The federal guidance is out there. A couple of things. We would recommend that LEAs definitely talk to their legal counsel on this one, because when you make this selection, it does impact if you do have dollars over that $500 per student limit. So it's important to note that you do limit yourself on those other dollars above that $500 student limit. So you need to be careful and definitely talk to your legal counsel and be aware of the state level requirements that are on top of those federal ones. So it is accurate that that is out there, but be cautious before utilizing that as your only guidance.
Just to clarify, do we need CDE approval if spending $5,000 or more of the ESSER funds?
And just to, jump back on the last question, I'll answer this one. If you take the $500 provision, you can't use the rest of your funds also on like PPE and cleaning supplies and things like that schools probably are going to need. So that's also something to remember on that. And so going your next question, sorry, I mean to steer us off track. Do we need pre-approval on purchases over $5,000? For the CR fund, you do not need that. But if you're using the ESSER DEER funds, you do need that. But like I said earlier with the CR fund, there's still going to be scrutiny, expect scrutiny, so make sure you're documenting that you look for cheaper alternatives for certain things. Another big one is being asked about like any type of building or anything like that. You should make sure that like if you're doing shade structures, that things are removable, that you're purchasing things that are meant to kind of be in the lifetime of the school year more so. I don't, if you understand what I'm saying. So like do not, structures or anything like that should be temporary, because we get a lot of questions about shade structures. But yeah, you do not need pre-approval for those, but just expect that, you still need to go through the same process of justifying why it's a necessity.
So we have a few salary questions. For some districts, they've negotiated to pay for the December salaries the first week of January. Would this still be an exception? Can they do this?
Yes, that would be allowable. And even if you hadn't paid it yet until January, once, like Dan said, once the services are provided, you would still count those as an expenditure for reporting purposes, since the services were already carried out. But you do have, a liquidation period afterwards, so that's acceptable because you're using them. As long as you're using them within the time frame, then that's fine.
And then under salary and benefits, can we charge stipends, extra hours related to duties that would not have otherwise been paid outside of COVID?
Yeah.
Say this is one of those areas where, again, legal counsel is key. And the reason why I say this, the federal guidance says there are only two categories of workforce bonuses that are allowed, and those are overtime and hazard pay. The federal FAQs do talk about stipends, and so they open the door to it there, but then it is, again, limited to those hours where it ties back to COVID or something like that. So you would want to be very careful here. However, say you had a custodian who is providing extra hours because they're doing extra cleaning because of the school. That's consistent with LLMF. That's consistent with CRF. Those hours could be covered. So it's going to really go back to what is the service provided, how does it tie back to COVID, and how is it related to LLMF. which is a really long way of saying it's complicated, but there are possibilities.
And can we charge tech support salaries beyond December 30th?
No, it has to be, the salaries would have to fall in that guideline. You can do it with ESSER or here general fund after, but for the CR fund, it's pretty blanket March 1st to December 3rd.
What is the expectations for how expenditures of these funds will be audited? Should we expect a federal audit? And if so, do you know the time frame?
We don't know the time frame on that. I mean, you should just, what we always tell people is prepare for the worst, hope for the best. So make sure we document, and talk to your legal counsel. That's, what we just say right off the bat. So I think that's the only expectation now, but as we get more information, we'll definitely share that on our website. You can email the CARES Act box to get on the listserv too, which we give a lot of announcements out to the listserv. So things like that we're constantly putting out there. When the updated FAQs came out from Treasury, we made that announcement through our listserv. So I think just you're going to have to kind of stay tuned for that type of information. But once we get it, we will share it.
Going back to the ESSER funds, who do we email for approval to spend ESSER funds if an expenditure exceeds $5,000?
That's the CARES Act inbox.
And I know that on the deadline, we've gotten this question before. Why is it not December 31st? And then can you clarify the cycle 3 reporting deadlines? Is it January 6th or the January 5th?
For the December 31st question, that is because of the federal legislation, the CARES Act specifically said December 30th. Why they didn't make it the end of the quarter, the end of the calendar year, that is a question for your local congressperson. For the deadline, approximately the 5th or the 6th, I realize that's not as firm as we'd like to be. We do have to package this information up for the Department of Finance. We then have to turn it around and report it to the U.S. Treasury. So I believe our deadline to get it to finance is right around there, and we're trying to give you as much time as possible. So if you're done by the 5th, that's even better. But we'll put out an update as we get closer.
What if vendors are struggling to get the items to send to fulfill purchase orders? Items may be received in January. Can CRF still be used to pay for these items?
Yes, so that's if it's no fault of your own. If you would reasonably expect to get it by December 30th, then it's allowable. But beware that you have to prove that. Obviously, you still have to prove necessity, and that's kind of a moving target with the U.S. Treasury. So again, we suggest talking to your legal counsel if you have questions about it, but also ensuring that things like devices, this is where this comes up. Mostly it's fine if you order devices and you would normally expect to get them and you don't, but it's okay to receive them afterwards, and that's U.S. Treasury has understood that. But don't, and especially now it's kind of getting closer and closer to that December 30th deadline. So I mean, it's getting harder to meet that necessity goal. So I would, advise LEAs order these things as soon as possible. I think, it's just, again, just be prepared to document everything, why it's needed, why it's necessary, but don't order devices the last week of December and expect that to meet necessity, because obviously it wouldn't. So.
I would just add that if you do have that scenario occur, originally the contract was for delivery in November and then it was delayed, you would then report that as an obligation for cycle 3. Once delivery actually occurs, then it would become an expenditure. So there are reporting mechanisms that allow for that, in addition to the federal guidance that allows for it.
We purchased hotspots for students for distance learning. Can we not prepay for the contract for the entire year since it's a flat fee per month per unit?
So if it's a per month fee, I would say probably not, because that's a very easy way for you it would demonstrate to the federal government there is a very easy way to account for these funds on a month-by-month basis. If there was no other stipulation, like if you prepay it all in full, starting one-time payment, then you got a discount, and there's no other policy that you have in place that allows for a prepayment, don't have much to stand on if a federal auditor comes to you.
And I think then that would apply to a multi-year contract for software that track student engagement progress. Would then the same thing apply?
Yeah, I would stay away from multi-year as much as possible. I think from guidance we've received, and again, it's not final, we always tell you to consult your legal representation, but it's from discussions we've had, more than a year is a little difficult to justify. I mean, it should be, within the life of the school year, I mean, there may be some exceptions, but I would stick to a year personally.
Will the reallocation of unspent CR funds within the school system be within the school system or outside?
This would depend on the Department of Finance's choice, but I think that if they are recouping large amounts of funds from schools, that would be an indication to them that schools did not need these funds, and therefore they wouldn't want to reappropriate them even to schools that do. So they would be looking at other areas where there's been general fund. One item that was discussed was the $100 million that was appropriated in SB 117. Could they reimburse the general fund just to make the general fund? So those are the kinds of things they would be looking at, and there may not be an additional direct benefit to schools.
And there was a statement made for all of us about a district being anxiously awaiting the receipt of Chromebooks for their students. There's been a tremendous backlog, and I think the department has heard that loud and clear as you've engaged in really supporting LEAs on attaining not just hotspots, but also technology devices, that we're all in this together about that real backlog that we're experiencing. So another question, for those hired to support learning loss mitigation, please confirm that we cannot cover the cost of the contract between January and June through those dollars that must be spent by December 30th.
Correct. This would go back to the prepayment, and that it would be a prepayment between January and June. So you would need to look at another funding source.
Please clarify whether or not the obligations need to be expended fully liquidated by December 30th.
So they do not. You would need to, when you report, reflect an expenditure and then an obligation for those things that weren't received that you would expect it to receive. And then in future reporting cycles, you would see it come down. However, this ties back to the reasonableness at the time of delivery. And like Joe said, you can't up your obligations last minute by saying, I put in another order for 1,000 new Chromebooks, and we're not going to get it until May. That would not be allowed.
If we had to purchase a license for an online educational platform and we entered in a 2-year licensing agreement and paid in full for the 2-year agreement utilizing these funds, would that be acceptable? And I think you've answered this before.
Yeah, this is, again, getting into that gray area of what would a federal auditor do, and that 2 years is a long time for funds that were appropriated for only 10 months, and particularly based on that a year and a half of it is going to be after the period. So you can try, but if you get audited and you have to pay those funds back, what is that going to look like? And is that a risk your district is willing to accept? So it would probably be better to use some of your other funds to avoid that scenario.
Any guidance around record keeping we need to do for personnel costs that are positions that were budgeted but are now going towards substantially different uses?
I think definitely document as much as you can and be prepared to explain to a federal auditor if that's necessary, but we can also connect you. There's a lot of resources on the CDE website for things like that, I'm on, documentation, and we can connect you. If you have to actually, we can get you kind of some more specific answers from our auditing team on, steps LEA should take in doing that. But I think since we're kind of not on the auditing side, we're not as familiar with kind of what that documentation looks like. So definitely ask that one to the CARES Act email box, and we'd be happy to get your response on it.
If you have a nurse typically on staff, are you saying that her salary could be paid for by resource 3220 between August and December?
Yes, because federal guidance does have a provision that medical personnel assigned to schools or associated schools are presumed to be substantially dedicated to COVID. There's a couple of caveats there, so you would want to double check that it meets your specific scenario. But that is one of the few areas where there is broader discretion given as far as the spending of the funds on personnel.
And going back on the mental health issue, learning loss funds are allowed to be spent on mental health needs for our students. If counselors are providing this, can we charge their salaries?
It would have to be, it's difficult because I don't think it fits in federally for, obviously not for an entire salary, but if you can justify extra time they worked in response to the pandemic, that might be allowable, but you would have to, I think I would advise that one's a little bit more difficult. I would rather use ESSER or GEAR funds for that one, if at all possible. I'd stay away from CR funds, just being safe and, conservative. Again, like Dan said, that could be a slippery slope when, dealing with federal audits down the road.
And I would add to what Joe said. CR funds are supposed to be for basically new cost, unbudgeted cost. If a counselor is performing substantially the same work, is that really new? If they're performing overtime, okay, that's new. So you may have to look at it and kind of break out a portion of their salary that could be charged rather than their whole salary. But we'd recommend taking a look. Email us, we'll send you the guidance on it, have your lawyers take a look and see how comfortable you feel.
And then I'll just fold another comment that they were treating counselors as social emotional support, which they saw as qualifying under the health and safety direction in SB 820.
And then that would be something that seems like that's substantially different work than what they had previously been doing. So then that does open up the door much more than if they were providing the same service. So these are all the kind of nuances that unfortunately exist. And we can't look at yeses.
What about the full annual cost of hotspot contracts that ends after December 20? I would assume ends December 2020. Can the full contract be charged to the LLM, or do we need to prorate up to December 2020?
Barring, because this would again be a prepayment, so barring anything that you have as a standard policy around prepayments that you could possibly stand on, you would have to prorate it, and anything after December 30th would be something you'd have to charge to your D or your ESSER or something else.
And then there was a statement that someone has submitted a capital expenditure application on October 8th and still has not received a response. Is this typical at this point?
No, we've responded. If you could resend it to us, because we've actually combed through, we have kind of listed all of our capital expenditures. So I don't know if something accidentally missed or what happened, but if you could please send it. Because what we do is kind of on a weekly basis, we're trying to look at those and then go through. Some we've asked for more information on, so if possibly that happened, because sometimes we do need more information. We don't know the funding source they're using, or a little more into, did you weigh out the options on something like this? So if you could please resend, and we'll jump right on that.
Okay. And then going back to, does medical personnel mean they have to be licensed? What about health clerks who assist the RNs?
Federal guidance does not get that clear. It just says medical personnel assigned to schools. So how much of a risk do you want.
And do you mind repeating the non-allowable PPE expenditures due to accepting the Cal OES PPE?
I think there are two things that play in here. If you accepted basically other provided PPE, you couldn't then, and that was funded some other funding source through the state, through federal funds, you couldn't double dip by then charging that amount to the CRF for the same good. There is a non-allowable issue if you were to take that $500 per people exemption, if you will, or allowance, and there are only 7 specific categories that you could then use any remaining funds on. And PPE and cleaning supplies are not part of that. So that would be a case where you could not use your CRF for those purposes.
Can we use CRF funds to purchase a vehicle to deliver meals to other school sites and to students who are distance learning but do not have transportation to pick up meals?
Yes, with some caveats. This does need to be a reasonable expenditure incurred for the time. One of the things to keep in mind is, are there other alternatives that are less costly that could have provided the same thing, like renting a vehicle or contracting out with a provider? Your nutrition is definitely an allowable cost under LOMF, but those are the kind of federal restrictions that might come into play under an audit. So you have to do due diligence there.
Can you clarify what CRF expenditures need pre-approval?
None of them. They don't need pre-approval from us. Just like Dan said, ensure that you're going through the steps of justifying why it was a necessary cost, being able to document that it was made in a timely, necessity and timely manner, and going through the steps of, looking at alternatives and being able to produce, documentation on, costing out alternatives in case you're audited.
Is there a possibility that the December 30th deadline can be extended with tons of question marks?
Nope. We would love that as much as you would, but unfortunately, I don't think that's not going to happen. It's pretty much a certainty unless, I hope I'm really wrong, but I don't think I am. Unfortunately, that's the deadline we have and we're given. And I would say that, just try to use these funds because, what other type of relief we might get federally is very up in the air. So please, let's try, to spend everything we have.
The only thing that I would add, because that December 30th deadline is federal, the state statute does allow for a later deadline if the feds extend the December 30th deadline. We're obviously less than 2 months from that deadline, and Congress does not seem to be anywhere near a stimulus bill right now that might extend it. So 99.9% chance it's not going to happen in December 30th. Or drop it.
If we create a temporary custodial salary position effective December 1st through the end of the school year, can we charge the entire salary to CRF funds since we need to hire the additional help to account for the staff going back to their regular jobs?
No, unfortunately, you'd only be able to charge to December 30th for that. But, if you have ESSER gear money available or general fund dollars, that would be allowable. But, unfortunately, CRF has to be for the services performed up to December 30th.
And as I'm trying to make sure that we've answered the same questions, and we know that we might have more. So again, we ask folks to contact us, but I'll ask a few more questions before our time runs up. Please review your comments regarding the $500 presumption. Do I correctly understand you to say that CDE may not utilize this presumption when auditing?
So I think just where we're at, and if Dan or Elly wants to jump in, I think that we're going through it right now, the guidance, but at this point, given that it does come with the pitfalls of it still doesn't allow you to a variety of options once you spend it. You know, it cuts down on the options you have to spend funds on, and given that we definitely advise that you speak with your legal counsel regarding it, but it still needs to meet learning loss mitigation fund allowable uses, and I think, you know, based on, you're still going to have to, even though it says that the federal government will, you know, presume that it's spent allowably, I mean, you're still going to have to prove timeliness and necessity and those type of things. So,
yeah, Joe?
Yeah, I think we're just kind of more at a speak to your legal counsel and.
Okay. Joe, your sound is going. I think we're losing you. So I'd like to jump on real quick. One of the things that we want to cover, I think, as a general blanket comment here is that CDE is only providing guidance. We recommend that your questions, really, you do take them back to your legal team and to your, as an administration team, deciding what level of risk you want to take on in your interpretation of these guidance. We're doing our best to interpret them the way we understand them in our conversations with DOF, the legislative intent, and those kind of things, but we do really encourage every question that you have to make sure that you're comfortable and your legal counsel is comfortable on those things. I think one other thing that we want to point out is the LLMF funds were allocated on the federal level to address the specific timeline between March, when school really shut down, and December. And so that's why they're limiting things to not allow you to do expenditures next year. That's what those other funds are for. LLMF is about the immediate need of when schools shut down and as you work back up to that. So if you can kind of think about it in that structure, that will help you kind of keep that fund in your mind. And Dan had come off mute for a moment, so I want to make sure he has an opportunity to give us some insight there as well.
Joe actually covered it. I was going to say that just because there may be more flexibility at the federal level, but you have existing state statute that is not as flexible, you would get dinged under one, if not the other. So something to keep in mind.
We are so thankful for the opportunity to work with you, with your members, and thank you so much to Sarah to making this happen and giving us this opportunity. We're very excited. I understand that there are questions in the Q&A and in the chat box that did not get addressed directly, and Sarah, we will work with you to help address some of those things, and we do encourage people to reach back out to us via the CARES Act email, of course, if they have specific questions as a follow-up here. We really do spend time trying to get those answered right away as quickly as possible to help provide that guidance.
All right, thank you. Thanks to our audience. Thank you for our panel of experts. I really appreciate the engagement and all the great questions that came in. We'll see you in about 2 weeks on our next WorkWise webinar. That's a mouthful. Have a great day. Thank you all.
Thank you.